It is a common misconception that lust is merely a synonym for physical attraction. In popular discourse, lust is often reduced to erotic craving or sexual impulse. However, classical philosophy, modern psychology, and narrative symbolism all converge on a much deeper definition. Lust is the unrestrained pursuit of gratification, in which desire overrides reason, empathy, and long-term well-being. Lust is not attraction, it is compulsion. It is not desire, it is obsession. It is not passion, it is domination. Within Fullmetal Alchemist, the homunculus lust embodies this deeper conceptual meaning. She is not merely a seductive figure, she is a manifestation of existential craving, representing humanity's tendency to prioritize immediate satisfaction over moral consequence, emotional integrity, and existential purpose. From biology to existential obsession. Attraction versus lust, a critical distinction. Attraction is biological, lust is psychological. Attraction arises from evolutionary programming, chemical signaling, pheromones, dopamine release, and subconscious genetic selection. It is a natural process that drives reproduction, bonding, and survival. Lust, however, is not bound by biology alone. Lust is attraction hijacked by compulsion. Where attraction simply notices, lust fixates. Where attraction invites, lust demands. Where attraction flows, lust consumes. In psychological terms, lust is a dopamine addiction loop. It is the transformation of natural desire into a reward-chasing mechanism. Once desire becomes compulsive, it ceases to serve survival and begins to erode identity, judgment, and moral agency. Lust is best described as a loss of internal governance, where impulse overrides rational self-regulation. Think of desire as fire. Contained in a fireplace, it warms the house. It provides comfort, survival, and stability. Left uncontrolled, it burns the house down. This metaphor perfectly captures the dual nature of desire. Controlled desire leads to focus, drive, ambition, creativity, emotional intimacy. Uncontrolled desire leads to obsession, impulsivity, addiction, destruction, and self-collapse. Lust emerges when desire escapes its cognitive boundaries. In neurological terms, this is when the limbic system overrides the prefrontal cortex, emotion overwhelms rational planning. The result is impulsive behavior, poor long-term decision-making, and moral disengagement. The psychology of lust, the dopamine trap, the neurobiology of craving. Lust operates through the brain's reward system primarily. Dopamine pathways, nucleus accumbens, ventral tegmental area. Dopamine is not the chemical of pleasure, it is the chemical of anticipation. Lust does not make you feel satisfied, it makes you want more. This is why lust is never fulfilled. The moment gratification occurs, dopamine collapses, triggering a craving rebound. This creates desire to anticipation, anticipation to brief satisfaction to emptiness, emptiness to renewed craving. This loop forms the neurobiological architecture of addiction. Thus, lust is not merely emotional, it is structural dependency. The bandwidth drain while lust destroys focus. Lust hijacks attention. Human cognitive resources are limited. The brain can only deeply process a small number of variables at once. Lust consumes disproportionate bandwidth, flooding consciousness with intrusive imagery, fantasy, longing, and impulse. This reduces analytical thinking, creative depth, strategic planning, emotional stability. The mind becomes enslaved to reward anticipation, not meaning production. This is why controlling lust directly correlates with increased productivity, emotional resilience, cognitive clarity, long-term planning. When lust dominates consciousness, life shrinks to a sequence of cravings. Lust as a symbolic being, lust as existential emptiness. In Fullmetal Alchemist, lust is not simply a villain, she is an existential embodiment of insatiability. Her defining feature is not sexuality, it is hunger. She is never fulfilled, she is never complete, she is never at rest. This endless craving mirrors a fundamental human condition, existential dissatisfaction. Humans constantly chase status, power, validation, pleasure, control, yet none of these permanently satisfy. Lust represents the psychological horror of eternal wanting. Lust believes she is dominant, she manipulates, she seduces, she intimidates, yet her power is illusory. True power requires internal stability. Lust lacks this. Her entire identity is reactive, shaped by craving, not agency. She does not choose, she is driven. In this way, lust is paradoxically one of the least free characters in the series. Her apparent dominance masks deep existential imprisonment. Lust as the shadow archetype. Carl Jung defined the shadow as the unconscious repository of repressed desires, impulses, and instincts. Lust is the external manifestation of humanity's shadow. She embodies repressed cravings, forbidden fantasies, socially unacceptable impulses, primitive drives. Rather than integrate these forces, humanity denies them, and denial gives them power. Lust exists because humans refuse to consciously acknowledge their own darkness. Lust and self-destruction. Lust operates on compulsive repetition. Compulsion arises when the brain anticipates reward, self-regulation collapses, emotional discomfort triggers craving. This is why lust intensifies under stress, anxiety, loneliness, depression. Lust becomes a coping mechanism, but one that deepens the wound it tries to heal. Self-betrayal and moral collapse. Lust prioritizes immediate gratification over integrity, loyalty, long-term purpose, emotional truth. This creates internal fragmentation, the splitting of the self. The individual becomes someone who desires one thing but believes in another. This psychological contradiction generates guilt, shame, anxiety, and identity erosion. The benefits of controlling lust. When lust no longer dominates mental bandwidth, the brain regains clarity, strategic depth, emotional stability, creative energy. The mind becomes expansive rather than reactive. Controlling lust does not mean suppressing desire, it means integrating desire into higher purpose. Lust and alchemical symbolism. Alchemy is transformation, lead to gold, impulse to wisdom, craving to purpose. Lust represents untransformed desire. She is raw energy without structure. Her destruction symbolizes the necessity of psychological transmutation. While lust is tragic, not evil. Lust is not evil. She is lost. She desires connection. She desires fulfillment. She desires meaning, but she only knows how to consume. This makes her one of the most tragic figures in the narrative. Dopamine. The chemical of anticipation, not pleasure. A fundamental misunderstanding about dopamine is that it produces pleasure. In reality, dopamine creates desire and expectation. Neuroscientific research shows dopamine spikes before pleasure occurs. Dopamine collapses immediately after satisfaction. This collapse produces a craving rebound. This creates a psychological treadmill, one to anticipate, to obtain, to emptiness, to want again. Lust thrives in this loop. It is not fulfillment seeking, it is craving sustaining. Thus, lust as a character symbolizes perpetual anticipation without resolution. She's never satisfied, she's always chasing. Neuroplasticity and addiction formation. The brain is plastic. Repeated behaviors physically reshape neural networks. When lust becomes habitual, dopamine pathways strengthen, prefrontal inhibitory circuits weaken, impulse control diminishes. This results in reduced ability to delay gratification, increased impulsivity, heightened emotional volatility. Over time, lust rewires personality. This is why addiction does not merely affect behavior, it alters identity. Lust, in this sense, represents a fully crystallized addiction identity. In psychological terms, lust produces state-dependent cognitive collapse. The individual becomes temporarily incapable of acting according to long-term values. This explains why intelligent individuals commit self-destructive acts under lust's influence. Aristotle and Virtue Ethics, the golden mean of desire. Aristotle argued that virtue lies in balance, not extremity. Between repression and indulgence lies temperance. Temperance is not abstinence, it is governed desire. For Aristotle, moral excellence requires that rational judgment rule over appetite. Lust therefore represents a breakdown of ethical hierarchy where lower instincts usurp higher reasoning. This imbalance erodes character. Thus, lust as a character symbolizes the collapse of ethical integration. Stoicism, freedom through internal sovereignty. The Stoics believed that suffering arises not from events, but from our attachments to desire. For Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, freedom meant mastery over impulse. Lust enslaves the will. True power, according to Stoicism, is autonomy of mind, the capacity to remain self-directed regardless of internal craving. Thus, Stoicism frames lust as existential bondage. Buddhism, craving as the root of suffering. Buddhist philosophy identifies tanha, craving, as the primary source of suffering. Lust is a manifestation of tanha. Craving binds consciousness to dissatisfaction because no pleasure is permanent. Thus, liberation requires not suppression, but detachment. Detachment does not mean emotional coldness, it means non-enslavement. Discipline versus repression. The psychological mechanics of self-governance. Why repression fails. Repression forces desire into unconscious shadow. This intensifies its psychological pressure. Eventually, repression leads to explosive release, compulsive relapse, emotional dysregulation. Repression does not eliminate lust, it magnifies it. Discipline as integration. Discipline does not deny desire, it redirects it. This process is called sublimation. Through sublimation, sexual energy becomes creativity, craving becomes ambition, impulse becomes focus. This is psychological alchemy, why lust is a necessary stage of development. Lust represents immature desire. Through struggle, reflection, and suffering, desire matures into wisdom. Thus, lust is not merely evil, it is a developmental crucible. Lust and the meaning crisis. Why craving flourishes in existential emptiness. The meaning, vacuum. How lust fills the absence of purpose. Human consciousness demands meaning. When meaning collapses, craving intensifies. Existential psychology identifies the meaning vacuum as one of the primary drivers of addiction, compulsion, and self-destructive desire. When individuals lack a compelling sense of purpose, their psyche seeks immediate substitutes. Lust becomes one of the most accessible replacements. Pleasure temporarily silences the terror of existential emptiness. In this sense, lust is not merely desire, it is an anesthetic against meaninglessness. Where purpose is absent, stimulation becomes sovereign. Viktor Frankl, Existential Frustration and the Will to Pleasure. Viktor Frankl, founder of logotherapy, argued that the primary human drive is not pleasure nor power, but meaning. When meaning is obstructed, individuals regress toward pleasure-seeking behaviors. This explains why depression often precedes addiction, loneliness precedes compulsive desire, hopelessness precedes impulsivity, lust becomes a proxy for purpose. However, pleasure without meaning leads to emptiness, intensifying the craving loop. Thus, lust both relieves and deepens existential suffering. Lust as existential substitution. Lust substitutes sensation for significance, intensity for intimacy, stimulation for self-transcendence. This substitution is unstable. No amount of gratification can compensate for a lack of meaning. Thus, lust becomes insatiable. Lust and existential anxiety escaping the self. The fear of being alone with one's mind. Modern individuals increasingly avoid silence. Silence exposes insecurity, fear, regret, emptiness. Lust offers escape. Craving floods consciousness, drowning existential awareness. In this way, lust becomes a psychological sedative. Distraction as psychological survival. Neuroscience shows that distraction reduces activity in brain regions associated with self-reflection, moral reasoning. Existential processing. Lust, by overwhelming attention, prevents the mind from confronting who am I, what am I becoming, what is my purpose. Thus, lust shields the ego from existential confrontation at the cost of growth. Why growth requires discomfort, meaning emerges through struggle. Lust bypasses struggle. Thus, lust halts maturation. It replaces effort with indulgence, discipline with impulse, self-confrontation with escape. This is why lust stagnates psychological development. Why purpose destroys lust. Purpose as psychological gravity. Purpose organizes cognition. When purpose is strong, attention aligns naturally toward growth, creation, contribution. This leaves little bandwidth for compulsive craving. Lust loses power in a purpose-driven mind, meaning as the ultimate antidote. Neuroimaging studies show that meaningful engagement reduces activation in craving circuits. Purpose competes directly with dopamine addiction loops. Meaning stabilizes emotional regulation. Thus, purpose is not merely philosophical, it is neuropsychological medicine. Why lust cannot survive self-transcendence. Self-transcendence shifts focus outward, lust focuses inward. When individuals commit to service, creation, legacy, sacrifice, lust becomes trivial. The role of suffering in human growth. Suffering forces introspection. Without suffering, self-awareness remains shallow. Lust avoids suffering, therefore it avoids transformation. The paradox of pain. Pain exposes limitation, limitation fosters humility, humility allows wisdom, thus suffering becomes the crucible of psychological depth. Lust interrupts this chain, while growth demands sacrifice. To become more, one must surrender less. Lust resists sacrifice, therefore it resists evolution. Lust as the enemy of becoming. Lust versus becoming. Existential philosophy frames life as becoming, not being. To become requires discipline, purpose, patience, and sacrifice. Lust demands instant gratification, minimal effort, maximum stimulation. Thus, lust directly opposes becoming. Alchemical transformation from lust to self-mastery. Alchemy as psychological metaphor. In Fullmetal Alchemist, alchemy is not merely a system of material transformation, it is a symbolic language of psychological evolution. Lead does not simply become gold, the self becomes wisdom. Alchemy expresses humanity's deepest longing to transmute suffering into meaning, impulse into discipline, chaos into order, and craving into purpose. Lust represents raw psychological energy, unformed, volatile, dangerous. In alchemical symbolism, this energy corresponds to prima materia, the primal substance of transformation. Lust is the chaotic beginning of the alchemical process, the blackening of consciousness. Classical alchemy begins with nigredo, the stage of decomposition and darkness. This is the collapse of illusions. Psychologically, nigredo corresponds to emotional crisis, moral breakdown, existential despair, identity collapse. Lust produces nigredo. When desire overwhelms reason, the self fragments. Guilt, shame, emptiness, and confusion emerge. This suffering is not accidental, it is necessary. The collapse of false identity allows reconstruction. The death of the old self, suffering as psychological alchemy. While transformation requires destruction, every rebirth requires a death. The self that lust creates must collapse. That self is impulse-driven, externally validated, pleasure-dependent, meaning-starved. To evolve, this identity must dissolve. This is the existential death. Psychological ego death. Ego death occurs when old narratives fail, old values collapse, old motivations lose power. This creates psychological emptiness, terrifying yet fertile. Here, consciousness becomes malleable. This is the alchemical crucible, the crisis that creates wisdom. Without crisis, wisdom remains theoretical. Suffering internalizes truth. Lust produces suffering. Thus, lust ironically becomes a teacher. It reveals the emptiness of pleasure and forces the psyche toward meaning. Lust as humanity's eternal mirror. Lust reflects humanity's deepest vulnerability, the inability to tolerate emptiness, and it exposes fear of stillness, fear of insignificance, fear of existential isolation. Thus, lust becomes both temptation and revelation, the paradox of desire. Desire creates movement, ambition, creativity, yet also suffering, fragmentation, addiction. Thus, desire is both engine and abyss, the true meaning of self-control. Self-control is not denial, it is liberation from compulsion. The disciplined individual does not lack desire, they command it. Psychological enlightenment from craving to creation. When lust is transcended, attention deepens, meaning intensifies, identity stabilizes. Life shifts from consumption to contribution, craving to creation, impulse to purpose. Final philosophical conclusion. Lust is not the enemy, unconsciousness is. Lust becomes destructive only when it operates without awareness, discipline, and meaning. Thus, the ultimate lesson of lust in Fullmetal Alchemist is not moral condemnation, it is existential awakening. She teaches, without self-mastery, desire enslaves. With self-mastery, desire liberates. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.